Lucasta Vale had spent 3 unhurried decades translating medieval charters and teaching wide-eyed freshmen that most grand vows in history were simply business contracts shaped like poetry, and she considered her own life proof that one could love language without ever submitting to its oldest metaphor, marriage. On the first Wednesday of February that certainty shattered like sugar glass. A freak electrical blaze consumed the aging warehouse where Vale Maple kept 6 seasons of bottled syrup, and the inferno melted not only stainless steel vats but also the family's fragile solvency. By morning the insurance carrier was citing obscure exclusions, creditors were circling, and foreclosure notices bloomed on the farmhouse porch like poisonous blossoms. Lucasta drove north from the college through sleet, mind sprinting across contingency tables, only to find her mother Rowena and stepfather Silas seated at the kitchen table with a stranger whose navy suit looked poured rather than tailored. Thaddeus Gravewood, founder of the quantum fabrication empire that bore his surname, spoke in a voice pitched just above the hiss of the wood stove and laid out an offer as old as dowry parchments she made students laugh about. He would erase every cent of debt, rebuild the warehouse with fireproof alloys, and pre-purchase 10 years of syrup production at triple market price, on one rigid condition. Lucasta must marry him within 30 days. The demand was not barked. It was delivered with the clinical calm of someone ordering custom circuitry, yet its audacity sent a hot-cold wave through the farmhouse air. Thaddeus slid a folder across the scarred pine table, a prenuptial agreement thick as a novella, drafted in near archaic legal diction that felt suspiciously intentional, as though he knew she would notice the references to Blackstone and dower rights. The document ring-fenced her academic salary, preserved her right to seek annulment after 48 months if irreversible. Emotional insolvency could be proven, and even granted her full editorial control over any memoir she might one day write about the Union. When she lifted her gaze, he met it without a flicker of coercive warmth, eyes the color of iced slate, and said only, "Your family's legacy is an algorithm that can still be solved. I am offering computational power." Rowena's knuckles were white on the teacup, Silas's gaze threaded between shame and pleading, and Lucasta's own pulse hammered with the realization that every theoretical lecture she had ever given about societal exchange was materializing in her parents' kitchen. Outside, the maple trees groaned under crusted snow, sap lines dangling like silent heartbeats, and she understood with painful clarity that refusing would sentence those trees, and the generations who tapped them, to auctioneer gavels. She asked for the night to review the contract. Gravewood accepted, leaving behind a business card etched not with ink but with microscopic holes that refracted lamplight into a ghostly hologram of his initials. Lucasta barely slept. She pored over the agreement until dawn, pausing only to stare at the farmhouse ceiling where smoke stains from the long-dead original boiler drew Rorschach maps of possibility. At 6:30, while the sky was still a blue bruise over the sugar bush, she signed on the final line, her pen trembling yet decisive, and set the document atop the maple butcher block where Thaddeus would retrieve it. In that ink stroke she traded the comfortable hypothesis of independence for the blunt experiment of an arranged marriage, convinced that language, her oldest ally, would supply the grammar needed to survive whatever equation waited beyond the altar. Snow persisted like a slow drum against the greenhouse panels of Aquila Spire the morning Lucasta wed the man who had bought her family's future. The venue, an angular prism of glass jutting from the Vermont hillside, was ordinarily reserved for biotech galas, but Gravewood's logistics team had converted it overnight into an ice garden cathedral. Violet heliotropes shimmered inside cryogenic terrariums, and silver filaments of liquid nitrogen traced lace-like plumes between the rows of ghost-white chairs reserved for venture capital partners and patent attorneys. Lucasta, sewn into a winter silk gown the color of unbleached parchment, caught her own reflection in a mirrored pillar and almost failed to recognize the scholar beneath the sheath of ceremony. Instead of pen smudges, her fingers wore frost-bright rings that matched the pearl comb in her dark, braided hair, and the usual wry tilt of her mouth had surrendered to a tight, unreadable line. Professor colleagues were absent, invited, yes, but too bewildered by the whirlwind announcement to brave icy roads, and the absence left her feeling strangely unsupervised, as if she were skipping her own lecture to appraise some clandestine ritual. Thaddeus stood at the altar beneath a suspension of programmable LEDs that pulsed faint aurora greens and arctic blues. He wore a tailored charcoal suit so precisely cut the seams seemed theoretical, only the faint rise and fall of his chest distinguished him from the marble sculptures flanking the aisle. When Lucasta joined him, he inclined his head with impeccable politeness and applied the slightest pressure to her gloved hand, neither ownership nor comfort, something cooler, a calibration of proximity. The officiant, a retired federal judge pulled from Gravewood's philanthropy board, read a streamlined ceremony that skipped sentimental flourishes and quoted state statute on matrimonial capacity. Vows were optional, and Thaddeus offered none. Lucasta, defiant in her serenity, filled the silence with a single line from Chaucer, "Love is a thing as any spirit free," knowing the archaism would puzzle half the room and signal to the other half that she was not mute property. Applause followed like polite rainfall, and in it she heard the clink of digital cameras cataloging the moment for shareholder newsletters more than for family scrapbooks. The reception measured out in half hours of asset manager small talk and monochrome canapes that tasted of ozone rather than herbs. Lucasta accepted congratulations with anthropological detachment, memorizing how Gravewood's associates referenced the marriage in the passive voice, such an innovative union, a strategic bond, as if agency itself belonged to their employer. When dessert arrived, she slipped away, and no one blocked her path. She was already woven into the tapestry of their calculations. Aquila Spire's penthouse suite awaited, high enough that wind knocked frost crystals loose from the steel superstructure. Inside, electric sconces cast a cold ivory glow across minimalist furniture arranged with the geometric cruelty of a physics diagram. 2 bedroom doors faced opposite directions like opposing coordinates. Thaddeus carried their luggage himself, an act that might have seemed gentlemanly if performed less methodically, placed her suitcase beside the left-hand door, and keyed both biometric locks into her wrist comm. Then, standing equidistant between thresholds, he explained the final clause his lawyers had drafted but left unstated in public. Physical intimacy was neither presumed nor required, each bedroom was a sovereign domain. Any convergence would occur only by mutual petition, documented verbally to avoid the coercive silence of unsigned papers. The phrasing slid from his tongue with dispassionate precision, yet Lucasta detected an undertow of anxiety, like a subharmonic rumble beneath an orchestral swell. She realized he was granting her a fortress because he had once needed one and found none offered. She nodded, not trusting her own voice, and reached to loosen the mother-of-pearl buttons at her collar. For a microsecond his gaze followed the motion, an involuntary flicker of warmth that cracked the glacial veneer. But he stepped back, retreating toward his own door as though distance were a firewall. Before disappearance, he added that a dawn flight to Tokyo awaited. Grave negotiations with a quantum optic supplier could not wait for honeymoons. He would depart at 4 a.m., leaving her the suite, the corporate driver, and a card granting unlimited access to the tower's private library. Then he vanished into his room, doors sealing with a pneumatic sigh. Lucasta remained in the hallway, pulse audible against silk, digesting the paradox of a wedding night defined by articulations of non-touch. She entered her room and discovered a tray on the nightstand, a demitasse of unsweetened espresso, a handwritten schedule of tomorrow's property transfer filings, and, oddly tender, a pair of noise-canceling headphones resting atop a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets. She set the coffee aside, too bitter, but opened the book, finding a ribbon bookmark placed on the poem about love that makes a life complete. Irony warmed her chest like contraband brandy. Beyond the window, snow hissed against glass, and freight trucks glittered along the interstate far below like lines of binary code. Sleep came in fragments. Twice she dreamed of sap buckets overflowing with ink, once of Thaddeus as a ghostly typographer positioning letters across an endless contract. At 3:50 a.m. the soft click of a suitcase handle woke her. She rose, barefoot, padded to the hallway, and found him already dressed in a steel-gray travel coat, hair still damp from a monastic shower. For a suspended instant neither spoke. He broke the stillness by handing her a slim black binder, the complete insurance reconstruction plan for Vale Maple, stamped approved in crimson. "Effective at sunrise," he said, voice softer than she'd heard it. "I keep promises on schedule." She could think of no scholarly response, so she murmured the ordinary, "Safe travels." He gave a single, almost uncertain nod, as if unused to being wished personal fortune, and disappeared down the service elevator, leaving only the faintest trace of cedar cologne and a silence so profound it chimed. Dawn finally seeped through the penthouse's crystalline ribs, painting the floorboards pale gold. Lucasta brewed tea, signed digital release forms, and traced her fingertip over the approved stamp until heat cooled in the cup. She understood that she had just vaulted from theory into praxis, that her lecture hall declarations about contracts and freedoms would now be tested every hour of her married life. Yet inside the ring of that recognition grew a flicker, not yet hope but the awareness of latent grammar, clauses unwritten, metaphors unbent, waiting in the wide margin between two opposing bedroom doors. Mid-March arrived wrapped in a sleet that sounded like static against the penthouse windows, and with it came the first tangible echo of Thaddeus in Lucasta's otherwise solitary routine. He still phoned only at scheduled intervals, precise, 10-minute calls that felt more like status meetings than marital conversation, but a courier now delivered a fresh stack of technical journals each Monday, always topped with a slip reading for Dr. Vale and the founder's clinically elegant hand. The journals were thoughtful, even flattering, yet they also reinforced the distance between them. She imagined him browsing airport bookshops, choosing titles as a scientist selects reagents, convinced information could stand in for intimacy. On the second Friday of the month the courier carried no cardboard sleeve, only a cream envelope sealed with a wax crest she did not recognize, two interlocking triangles, one inverted, one upright, like a heraldic hourglass. The handwriting on the front was calligraphic and archaic, her name penned as Lady Lucasta Gravewood, a formality that prickled her skin more than it pleased. She waited until the courier's footsteps vanished down the hall before unsealing the flap. Inside was a single photocopied newspaper article dated 22 years earlier, brittle type darkened by the toner. The headline, Shaun Architects Cult Exposed, stretched across the page, and beneath it a grainy photo captured a teenage boy led from a courthouse in handcuffs, eyes wide with stunned fury. The caption identified him as Thaddeus E. Gravewood, 17, escapee and plaintiff. Lucasta drew a long breath, hearing her pulse in her ears like sudden surf. The text recounted how a secretive religious commune in Northern California had arranged pseudo-marriages among its wealthy wards to consolidate control over inheritances. Because Thaddeus fought the ritual and sought legal emancipation, the sect had allegedly confined him for 6 months until a federal task force intervened. He later testified against the elders, winning release of other minors. The trial gutted the group, but tabloids dubbed him the cursed groom of Silicon Valley, a moniker that clung long after his first patents turned him into a prodigy rather than a victim. Lucasta reread the article 3 times, each iteration changing her chemical composition, first shock, then a scholar's curiosity, finally a heavy empathy that settled behind the sternum like cooling lead. Memories rearranged themselves. The spare way he avoided small talk. The fortress of legal clauses erected around their physical space. Even the monotone in his voice when he discussed obligations. None of it seemed cold any longer, only overheated metal that had been quenched too fast, left brittle so it would not bend again. She paced the suite, the newspaper trembling at the edge of her fingers while snowmelt drummed against roof drains, trying to decide whether revelation excused the price she had paid, or whether price and pardon were irrelevant categories in a life this prematurely excavated. That evening she attended her lecture series via live stream from the penthouse library. Students noticed something altered. After session, a senior advisee lingered in the chat to ask if she was unwell. Lucasta typed a reassuring if evasive reply, yet the encounter nudged her toward a plan. She would not stew in speculation, language, her craft, demanded dialogue. At midnight, unable to wait for Thaddeus's time-zone-coordinated phone call, she composed a handwritten note on cream stationery that bore the Vale maple watermark. I will not echo the prisons you outgrew. I am here to translate the silence if you let me. She folded the letter around the photocopy, placed both in a clear document sleeve, and carried the package to the elevator leading to his sealed work study 2 floors below. The biometric scanner recognized her new credentials. He had discreetly added her to the whitelist, and the doors parted to reveal a cavernous office where holographic schematics crawled across glass partitions like slow lightning. She laid the sleeve dead center on his immaculate blackwood desk, weighing it down with a brass paper knife shaped like a quill. For a moment she stood there listening to the server racks breathe, aware that hidden security lenses were tracking her every movement. She raised one hand in a deliberate half-wave to the cameras, a gesture of acknowledgement to whomever monitored the feed, then left the office dark except for the soft aurora of data flux. Thaddeus's weekly call arrived 2 days later, just after dawn in Vermont, evening in Osaka. His opening question bypassed pleasantries, "You've been in my private archive." She sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a wool shawl, tea cooling beside her, and answered calmly that a marriage license conferred at least as much access as a corporate badge. He was silent. Through the speaker she could hear distant airport announcements in Japanese, a murmur of travelers. When he finally spoke, the cadence lacked its usual metronome precision. "I do not discuss that period," he said. She countered that withholding truth was not the same as safety, citing a medieval proverb about locked chests rusting from the inside out. An exhale brushed the microphone, a sigh or perhaps an accidental confession. He promised they would talk in person upon his return, but his voice stumbled softly on the word promise, as though it were a cliff he feared leaping twice. Waiting became a test of discipline greater than any linguistic exegesis she had ever tackled. She filled daylight hours cataloging Vale Maple's salvaged ledgers for the insurance auditors, translating the archaic French annotations her great-grandfather had scrawled in the margins. Evenings she explored the tower's private library, discovering that Gravewood's architects had designed shelves with motorized ladders responding to whispered ISBNs. One night, perched high above the parquet floor, she unearthed a monograph on cult deprogramming with footnotes written in Thaddeus's boyish handwriting, margins bristled with equations, entropy analogies juxtaposed against emotional resilience scores. Every penciled variable looked like his trying to convert trauma into solvable physics. She laid her palm on the page, a silent vow that the math would no longer be solitary. Thaddeus landed in Boston a week later, storm closing the Vermont runways. Instead of waiting for daylight, he chartered a SnowRunner helicopter north. Lucasta heard the blades at 3 a.m., a thud like giant hearts over the ridgeline. She descended to the hangar foyer in slippers and coat, hair unbraided, feeling every cliché of anxious spouse yet dismissing none of the gravity. The glass airlock opened, there he stood, coat ripped at the shoulder by a stray rotor gust, cheeks raw from cold, holding her document sleeve in one gloved hand. He did not approach at first, only studied her face as if memorizing whether she still inhabited it the same way. When he spoke, breath crystallizing between them, his tone was neither apology nor defense but rough-edged concession. "I was formed where language failed. If you intend to use grammar as rescue, you need the whole archive." Then, for the first time, he reached bare fingers to trace the curve of her wrist where the pulse beat strong. She felt a tremor pass from his skin into hers, voltage seeking ground, and realized his body kept history in its every small shiver. No vows were exchanged in that foyer lit by emergency sodium lamps, yet something close to covenant unfurled there, fragile as first thaw. He asked if she would walk with him to the lab at dawn. He had a demonstration prepared, a lattice of living quartz he claimed could measure sincerity in vocal microfluctuations. She agreed, though dawn was hours away. They sat on a steel bench meant for baggage carts, sharing silence that no longer felt like a wall, and outside the snow sifted sideways under floodlights, rewriting the shape of pathways that by morning they would cross together. Dawn smeared a pale rose line across the Adirondack horizon as Lucasta followed Thaddeus down a service corridor she had never noticed during her weeks in the tower. The entrance to Crystal Compass lay behind an unmarked alloy door whose biometric pad scanned pupils rather than fingerprints, and when the lock disengaged she felt a mild pressure in her inner ear, as though the chamber beyond possessed its own miniature atmosphere. Inside stretched a vaulted hall 2 stories high, its ceiling a tessellation of hexagonal quartz plates threaded with optic fibers that pulsed in colors too subtle for ordinary lighting schemes. Along the polished basalt floor, dozens of transparent globes hovered on magnetic plinths, each globe housed a lattice of vapor-grown crystal shards so fine they looked like frozen breath. Fluorescent markers were embedded at the tips of the shards, and as Lucasta stepped nearer, the markers brightened and dimmed in complex rhythms that reminded her of heart monitors rendered as auroras. Thaddeus explained that every lattice was tuned to a narrow range of sonic frequencies, when a human voice entered the bandwidth, the shards resonated microscopically, converting vibration into minute photon bursts that could be recorded and analyzed for patterns of stress, timbre, and semantic entropy. In other words, the system measured sincerity not by lie detector heuristics but by the resonant coherence between what was said and how the body's unique acoustic signature normally behaved in non-threatened states. He guided her to the centermost plinth where a larger sphere floated, its interior crystal web more densely woven than the rest, surfaces angular yet somehow organic, like a spiderweb spun from diamonds. He removed a velvet pouch from his inner coat pocket, withdrew a thumb-sized tuning key engraved with the same twin triangle crest she had seen on the wax seal, and inserted it into a narrow aperture at the globe's base. Immediately the optic fibers overhead dimmed, then a single filament of opalescent light dropped from the ceiling like a silk thread and entered the globe through an imperceptible port. The lattice ignited in prismatic convolution, colors blooming and collapsing in nested Mobius bands. Lucasta's breath caught. Before she could voice wonder, Thaddeus handed her a wireless throat mic and instructed her to stand on a silvered disc inlaid on the floor. She complied, feeling the faint hum of current beneath the soles of her boots. His first request seemed simple: speak any word she considered unbreakably honest. She hesitated, glancing at him, tall, vigilant, shoulders held in a posture that communicated readiness and apology simultaneously, then whispered the same word she had written in her note, mercy. The lattice responded with an immediate flare of deep turquoise, then leveled into a steady luminance that rippled outward in concentric rings. On a side console, holographs populated with numerical cascades, frequency deviation minimal, harmonic convergence high, decay rate slow. Thaddeus murmured approval, fingers flying across a suspended keyboard, and explained that turquoise within this palette denoted an emotional register dominated by protective empathy. She wondered if the machine had been calibrated by someone who had never known mercy and therefore revered it as a rare element. He then spoke a word of his own, threshold, and the sphere shifted to a muted violet halo, data spikes fluttering like moth wings before stabilizing. He studied the readout, nodded once, and told her violet indicated wariness edged by hope, a precise mixture he claimed to find the space between their separate bedrooms. Lucasta asked for the opportunity to test a sentence rather than a word. He agreed, adjusting the gain. She took a breath and said, I believe contracts fail when we treat them as fortresses instead of bridges. The globe shimmered through gradients of sea green into sunrise gold, then coalesced into a braid of both hues that spiraled along the crystal filaments. Thaddeus's eyebrows lifted, a rare crack in his composure, and he pointed at the monitor where a near-perfect sinusoidal curve unfurled. That pattern, he explained, indicated semantic alignment. The structure of her statement matched the emotional architecture of her delivery, rendering deception mathematically negligible. He repeated the sentence back to her. In his voice the lattice flared gold first, then pulsed with a storm of minor blues, the graph revealing tension points where belief jostled with long-bred skepticism. He did not annotate those anomalies verbally, yet Lucasta recognized in his clipped inhalation the vulnerability of a scientist whose instrument finally exposed truths he could not reroute through equations. Thereafter he invited her to move among the plinths at will, to test vowels and murmured histories, and each globe responded with its private aurora, a chromatic language that seemed less about passing judgment than about revealing topographies of emotion she had seldom mapped even to herself. Words linked to the farm, sap, granite, grandfather, painted soft oranges tinged with earth brown, colors the console translated as stable nostalgia. Academic terms, etymology, codex, philology, produced crisp sky blues lined with logical green peaks, marking cognition untainted by threat. When she finally spoke his name, Thaddeus, the lattice lightened with surgical white, then cooled to ash gray before settling into a pale rose identical to the one that had greeted dawn outside. He exhaled a sound that might have been her name in return, but it blurred into the chamber's hum. After 2 hours the optic fibers overhead dimmed to indicate energy cycle limits, yet neither of them moved to leave. The temperature had dropped, condensation ghosted from their words. She noticed fine tremors in his right hand as he disengaged the tuning key, nerves worn thin by confronting data that refused to hide. On impulse she reached out, steadied his wrist, and felt his pulse sprint under fingertips. The mystic machinery and the metrics it spawned were extraordinary, but the human heartbeat remained Messier, uncharted, unwilling to submit to color codes. He let her hold the wrist for 3 beats, 4, then rotated his palm until their fingers laced. In the silence that followed, a single quartz shard within the primary lattice continued to flicker, cycling through rose and turquoise, unable to decide which belonged, until finally it merged them into a muted lilac glow that neither console nor scientist had a pre-programmed label for. Thaddeus released her hand only when the overhead lights brightened back to maintenance white, signaling staff would soon arrive. He secured the tuning key in its pouch, placed it in her palm with ceremony bordering on reverence, and said she was free to access Crystal Compass whenever she wished. The system would remember her vocal fingerprint and calibrate to her presence. Lucasta considered the tiny key, its triangular crest catching inverse reflections, and understood this was not just permission but a trust offering rooted deeper than formal vows. They left the lab side by side, walking slowly through corridors where motion sensors activated pools of light ahead of their steps, extinguishing them behind, as though the building itself was teaching them to focus on the path forward rather than the lockable doors now closing in darkness at their backs. Lucasta first noticed the tremor in the company's public image when her late-night email alerts, usually a sleepy stream of engineering updates and maple price forecasts, erupted with links to a glossy business blog teasing an exposé titled, "Tainted Trees, the Dark Syrup Scandal Beneath Gravewood's Fairy Tale Marriage." By dawn the teaser had metastasized into 100 copy-paste summaries across finance and foodie channels, each claiming that preliminary USDA lab tests had discovered persistent pesticides in Vail Maple's soil and that anonymous insiders were whispering about an imminent FDA probe. The posts arrived in suspicious synchrony, too polished to be rumor and too vague to be legitimate science, yet the algorithmic frenzy did its work. Distributors called Rowena in panic, boutique grocers pulled product from front shelves, and a regional morning show cued a chirpy segment asking whether specialty syrups were the next glyphosate disaster. Lucasta, reading on her phone in the elevator, felt her stomach drop in a freefall more violent than the cab's descent. By the time she reached the corporate command floor, the story's newest permutation included a photo of her wedding reception, heliotropes glowing under nitrogen mist, paired with a caption casting the union as an elaborate bid to launder toxic assets through social media fairy dust. In the war room outside the board suite she found 3 senior compliance officers hunched over tablets and looking ashen, none dared offer a customary nod. Inside the suite, a sliding glass wall doubled as a live sentiment monitor, bars flipping crimson as negative keywords spiked. Thaddeus had not yet landed from a factory inspection in Dresden, so the board's emergency quorum was being chaired by Ruth Anwell, the chief risk officer whose entire aesthetic, from graphite pixie cut to gunmetal manicure, telegraphed anticipatory mistrust. She paused only long enough to recognize Lucasta's entrance before launching back into a projection of headline contagion curves. The tone in the room asserted, without saying it outright, that the scholar wife was ornamental to this discussion at best. As Ruth proposed a wait and audit posture, let the regulators sniff around, if we're clean, the story will die by entropy. Lucasta scanned the data wall and spotted the influencer who had poured ignition fluid on the rumor, Fenimore Knox's media strategist, a lifestyle vlogger famous for sugar detox challenges that always coincided with her employer's corn syrup campaigns. Knox, the cane and beet magnate who had spent 2 decades swallowing heritage maple brands, must have decided he could not buy Vail Maple outright after Gravewood's intervention, so he meant to crater its value until a bargain sale became inevitable. Lucasta cleared her throat, a modest sound that nevertheless silenced the room because the board rarely heard her speak. She requested the floor not as spouse but as proprietor of the farm being slandered. Then, in a voice trained by years of lecturing, she deconstructed the blog posts line by line, explaining which citations were forged, which lab numbers impossible because the lab in question had lost its pesticide license 2 winters prior, and which rhetorical pivots converted hypothetical risk into declarative doom. She did not stop at analysis. She proposed an immediate third-party soil assay conducted by the State Agricultural College 90 miles south, live-streamed for transparency, with real-time chain of custody broadcast on the same platforms now recycling the scandal. Ruth objected that cameras could backfire if a technician sneezed or a detector flickered. Lucasta countered that every hour of silence ceded narrative territory to Knox. Scholars knew that vacuums were never empty in the public mind, they were filled by the loudest superstition available. A young director asked who would front the media if readings came back clean, given that Thaddeus faced a 9-hour flight delay. Lucasta said she would, because the farm's Latin motto, Melior lectio quam rumor, truth over rumor, had been her doctoral epigraph long before she married into quantum capital. The board still hesitated until she dropped her final card. If they preferred inertia, she would move Vale Maple operations into independent bankruptcy reorganization, insulating Gravewood circuits from reputational fallout while fighting Knox alone, but the moment she filed, every journalist in New England would frame it as silent confession. That prospect cracked the impasse. Ruth authorized the essay with a clipped nod, and the legal team sprinted into logistics mode, dispatching drones, press kits, and 2 armored vans carrying sterile coring equipment. Lucasta rode shotgun in the first van, her wedding band cold against the steel clipboard holding chain of custody forms. Snowmelt had turned the access road into slush, but the sugar bush stood serene, its trunks laced with blue tubing that angled sap into stainless barrels glittering under late winter sun. She donned gloves, signed custody seals, and watched agronomists drill sample cores at 10-foot intervals while a student videographer streamed the process on 3 major platforms. In the comments feed, trolls jeered about staged evidence, yet viewership climbed above 1 million inside an hour, curiosity apparently overpowering cynicism. By late afternoon the on-site spectrometer ruled out the 3 pesticides Knox's posts had named. Graduate chemists would still run full chromatography back at the university lab, yet preliminary data already showed background levels consistent with organic forestry. Lucasta allowed herself one shaky exhale, then pivoted to camera, explaining results in plain language for parents worried about breakfast tables. She concluded with a challenge: any executive, influencer, or media pundit who doubted the evidence was welcome to send their own forensic team, provided they live-streamed every collection step. When the broadcast ended, she called Thaddeus, who had finally landed at Logan International. Exhaustion and altitude rasped his voice, but pride cut through. He said the board feed showed sentiment curves reversing. She expected him to ask about her well-being, instead he offered a statistical observation: internet outrage decayed faster when the correction came from a target group's perceived underdog rather than its patriarch, meaning her, not him. She replied that sometimes etymology beat econometrics, people liked words that tasted of sap and soil, not balance sheets. He laughed, a tight unpracticed sound, then said he would be home before midnight and that she should rest. She answered honestly that she would not sleep until the university's final mass spec readouts published to the blockchain, and he conceded by promising coffee on arrival. The call ended with neither of them mentioning love or thanks, yet Lucasta sensed a filament of alignment, perhaps a faint rose turquoise flicker in some quartz shard deep below the tower's foundation. The next morning Knox attempted a counterstrike, releasing drone footage that showed a cluster of diseased maples on state land adjacent to the Vale property. He insinuated that root systems ignored property lines. Lucasta met the volley before breakfast, posting Forestry Service records proving the sick trees had been culled last year and that root severance trenches protected the farm's perimeter. She accompanied the data with a 30-second clip of herself tasting fresh sap from the healthiest tree in the stand, letting the clear liquid fall into a sterile vial, then sealing it for independent lab delivery. The clip went viral not because of scientific rigor but because of her calm, almost elegiac gaze into the camera as she labeled the vial like a caretaker nailing a nameplate to a cradle. Commentators began calling her the Maple Archivist, a moniker she found embarrassing yet strategic. Archivists, after all, were guardians of truth yet seldom lightning rods for scandal. 3 days later the university released its certified report: no detectable synthetic pesticides, soil microfauna robust, sap-sugar ratios exemplary. Gravewood's PR division launched a coordinated rebuttal, attaching the study to every social post that had spread the rumor. Thanks to Europe's Digital Integrity Directive, each platform now had to display the correction alongside the original claim. Knox issued a non-apology about raising valid consumer questions, but his share price dipped 6%, investors spooked by someone willing to rebut in real time rather than sue in private. Rowena called Lucasta in tears of relief, and Silas promised to hang the university certificate beside the farmhouse hearth. Back at the tower the board convened again, this time to draft a public commendation. Ruth, in a rare relinquishment of corporate aloofness, handed Lucasta a crystal plaque etched with the company crest and the inscription, "For proof that data, delivered with courage, is still the most disruptive technology." Lucasta accepted, though she wondered which mattered more, the citation or the unspoken admission that her role had evolved from collateral to catalyst. When Thaddeus entered, coat dusted with road salt, the directors instinctively straightened as though bracing for analytic critique, but he offered none. Instead he crossed the room to his wife and, before the LED sentiment wall and the silent witness of his highest officers, removed one black leather glove, took her plaque-free hand, and pressed it to his chest, a brief, formal vow that needed no courts to verify resonance. No one applauded, they merely exhaled, perhaps realizing that the most critical algorithm in the building now involved two human variables they could neither model nor manipulate. That night, in the penthouse kitchen, Lucasta found the promised coffee and an unfamiliar glass jar on the counter. Inside was syrup so dark it approached mahogany, its surface swirling with iridescent motes, microscopic sheets of edible mica coated to refract an emerald shimmer when warmed. A label in Thaddeus's precise block letters read Aurora Batch 0, for when truth needs a little northern light. She laughed, feeling tension uncoil in muscles she had not known were knotted, and poured a thread over oatmeal. The syrup caught the under-cabinet LED glow and blossomed into miniature curtains of green and violet, like a private aurora contained in breakfast. As she tasted it, complex with earth and stars, she realized the scandal had inadvertently fused syrup and quantum optics into a narrative stronger than any marketing brainstorm. But more important, it had fused her resolve to his cautious intellect, proving that partnerships born of necessity could evolve into alliances that neither competitor machinations nor algorithmic storms could easily unweave. Rain replaced the late-season snow without softening the cold, turning the hills into channels of silver runoff that rushed toward the Connecticut River like whispered instructions, and in that gray waterlogged lull the next strike came, calculated, brazen, and timed for the single evening both Thaddeus and Lucasta were scheduled to be away from the tower. She had accepted a guest lecture invitation at Dartmouth on medieval debt forgiveness, a nod to her suddenly newsworthy expertise in crisis rhetoric. He was due in Montreal to finalize a cryogenic sapphire supply contract for Crystal Compass. Two helicopters lifted within minutes of each other, twin blades whipping sleet off the landing pads, but the threat was already burrowing under steel and concrete far below. A 5-person extraction team, faces hidden behind generic courier masks, slipped through a maintenance loading dock at dusk using forged subcontractor badges that bore Gravewood's own security hologram. The intruders, not ordinary saboteurs but elite urban spelunking mercenaries with the noirish call sign, Bourbon Hour, headed straight for Lucasta's private archive on sublevel 6, the vault where original Vale Maple ledgers now resided beside her handwritten field notebooks. The job, purchased with untraceable crypto that Fenimore Knox had funneled through shell frontiers, was twofold: abduct the proprietor long enough to coerce a signed statement that the lab results were falsified, and seed explosive thermite charges along the prototype optical lines of Crystal Compass as insurance. Their algorithm, however, had not accounted for the unpredictable force of an overworked systems electrician named Maribel Quince, who chose that exact hour to finish overtime rewiring a chilled water pump. She spotted the strangers wheeling a Pelican case too large for envelope delivery and thumbed her radio to dispatch before Bourbon Hour code breakers jammed the frequency. One terse call reached Security Hub Delta before the jammer lit, and that single garbled syllable, enough, started a clock ticking. 50 miles north, Lucasta had just begun parsing a slide on medieval tally sticks when an usher in conference black approached the lectern with a phone cradled on a silver tray. Thaddeus's face filled the screen, the jet cabin's LED wash flattening his features into urgent geometry. He did not waste a syllable: security breach at tower, extraction attempt, you're a target, evac underway. The line cut, a counter-signal fried the connection, leaving only a thin tone. The college's crisis protocol locked all outer doors automatically, yet that meant nothing if Bourbon Hour reached her first. Lucasta turned to an audience of 200 undergraduates and visiting scholars waiting for the next slide and announced with terrifying calm that the lecture must adjourn, citing a chemical ventilation alert. Emergency lights popped amber, and campus security herded the hall as she slipped through a backstage exit into service corridors smelling of disinfectant and old programs. In Montreal, a different fight unfolded within Gravewood airspace. Thaddeus ordered the pilot to abort descent for customs and instead vector south along Lake Champlain, where a night landing on the company's research barge could bypass border formalities. He spent the next 15 minutes issuing layered overrides, one to reroute power from lobby atriums into sublevel blast doors, another to wake the in-tower AI, Halcyon, from passive indexing to active defense. Halcyon's machine vision, trained on thousands of employee gates, swept camera feeds until it caught the carriage sway of a courier who moved like a climber, knees flexed for invisible rungs. The AI sealed magnetostriction bolts along Corridor 5, sealing Bourbon Hour between Lucasta's archive and the optic fiber trunk. Trapped is not neutralized, and the team leader, an athlete of subterranean catwalks with a silver septum ring and an accent bred from multiple state lines, knew it. She shifted to audio intimidation, triggering personal comms that broadcast Lucasta's voice spliced from interviews, a ghostly plea echoing through ventilation shafts, "Help me, please, it's burning." Any guard hearing that would override locks on instinct, but Halcyon flagged the waveform mismatch, spectrograph peaks didn't match Lucasta's lab-recorded stress register, and stonewalled. Yet another battlefield opened on the highway where Lucasta, now in a campus shuttle driven by a jittery grad student, watched hazard lights strobe behind, two black SUVs edging lanes apart with precision choreography. She told the student to floor it toward the state trooper way station ahead, counting on Knox's mercenaries to balk at cameras and sworn officers. They did not. The SUVs accelerated, one slaloming to the front, forcing the shuttle into a spin that skidded across rain-slick asphalt and came to rest in gravel 30 yards from the checkpoint. Drivers in courier masks dismounted with stun batons, but Lucasta had already climbed through the shattered emergency hatch, guiding the trembling grad student toward the way station's floodlights. Sirens erupted, troopers drew weapons, the masked men retreated without the prize, and she realized with staggering clarity that the real objective was no longer abduction, it was destruction of the archive and crystal compass whether she lived or not. Inside the tower, Bourbon Hour switched tactics as external extraction collapsed. They unpacked thermite disks the size of hockey pucks, slapping them onto conduit plates humming with optical data for sincerity spectroscopy. The leader synced detonators, announced a 90-second burn timeline, and readied climbing axes for a vertical escape shaft. That timeline narrowed to 50 seconds when magnetic field readings warned that Halcyon had overridden structural heat thresholds. The AI was about to vent argon into the confinement zone, starving the thermite. 50 seconds became 20 when the mercenaries realized their escape route, shaft Delta 9, now displayed a red vacuum seal. The Septum Ring leader cursed Knox for cheap intel and ordered an emergency breach of Archive Vault 6 as a consolation heist. If they couldn't ruin the lab, they would ransom Lucasta's notebooks. That steel vault door had been engineered by Thaddeus personally 3 months earlier, after learning the value of analog memory. It responded not to biometrics but to a spoken phrase of Chaucer in Middle English, rendered in Lucasta's intonation. Anything else triggered a local hypercooled seal. The leader's first drill bite sent -196 degrees Celsius liquid nitrogen flooding through microvalves. Her glove froze to metal, forcing her to tear away, leaving skin behind, a white horror beneath LED spill. She screamed, not in surrender but in rage, and shoved a thermite disc at the valve seam, desperate. 19 floors above, Thaddeus's helicopter reached rooftop skid plates. He sprinted through crosswinds, suit coat crackling like a sail, and descended internal lifts while Halcyon narrativized the unfolding timeline in his ear. He did not head for the breach site, instead he detoured to Crystal Compass's control mezzanine where Lucasta's tuning key, kept in a biometric safe, nested like a sliver of memory. He overrode permissions, retrieved the key, and palmed it until the triangular crest warmed, then whispered into a desk mic, "Override Lattice A1, vocal code Gravewood/Vale." Quartz spheres bloomed life, channeling stored acoustic energy into sonorous vibration that filled ventilation shafts with a resonant chord, not unlike the distant echo of church bells underwater. The frequency had one purpose: it destabilized the ferromagnetic anchors of any unshielded thermite charge in the network, forcing nanoshake that dislodged primer caps. Down in the sub-level corridor sparks coughed, charges popped harmless slag, and the saboteurs staggered under the sonic pulse, helmets ringing. Security reached the corridor first, weapons drawn, but Thaddeus arrived seconds later, ordered guns lowered, and addressed the bleeding leader directly. He offered medical care if they surrendered drives and footage, citing Geneva cyberwar clauses. She laughed blood through her teeth, called him the cursed groom, and spat that no clause could erase a bounty. Still, as guards cuffed them, her glare flicked to Lucasta's notebooks behind frostwhite steel and softened in a flicker of professional respect. Even pirates respect archivists, she muttered before paramedics sedated her. Lucasta, escorted back by state patrol, entered the tower at dawn, hair stiff with highway rain and eyes hollow with a night of flashbacks. Thaddeus met her at the lobby, flanked not by executives but by a single medic who offered to check for shock. She waved the medic off, stepped into the radius of her husband's outstretched arm, and, without preamble, rested her forehead against his collarbone. He whispered that the lab stood, her notebooks were untouched, and Knox's digital fingerprints coded every crypto payment to Bourbon Hour. She caught the tremor in his voice when he added, "I thought I understood thresholds." She replied that thresholds moved, but bridges could be widened after each storm, and for the first time she felt his arms lock fully around her, not cautiously but with the totality of someone staking territory against future incursions. Quartz could measure sincerity, yes, but in that corridor of morning light sincerity radiated unquantified, beating in the shared throb of pulse points pressed together as the tower's security shutters lifted one by one, welcoming the difficult day. Morning light worked its way through the penthouse's rain-streaked curtain wall like hesitant applause, and Lucasta, still in yesterday's damp coat, stood at the far window watching the city reset its pulse. She felt as if her own bloodstream had been reclocked in the night, recalibrated by adrenaline, fear, and the jolt of being folded, finally, unmistakably, into Thaddeus's protective orbit. He approached without shoes, the hush of socked feet strangely intimate against hardwood, and set 2 mugs on the narrow balcony ledge, one chicory coffee for him, one oolong for her. They drank in silence for several sips before he produced a flat, obsidian-black memory wafer no larger than a postage stamp. Halcyon, he explained, had collated every frame of Bourbon Hour's incursion, every crypto transaction linking the mercenaries to Fenimore Knox, and compressed the proof into that wafer. The Department of Justice would want full chain of custody originals, but this shard was theirs, a private talisman of survival they could keep even after litigation swallowed the rest. He handed it over, yet did not let go until she curled her fingers tightly around the cool edge, a tacit promise not to carry evidence alone. Later that afternoon, the board assembled in Auditorium Delta for what the calendar blandly labeled Extraordinary Session B. Ruth Anwell opened with a performance of grim efficiency, outlining Knox's liability and the probability of a countersuit larger than Vale Maple's annual revenue. Most directors responded with cautious enthusiasm, eager to weaponize the scandal's reversal into settlement cash. Lucasta listened from the second row, aware that cameras streamed every tick of her expression to shareholders. When Ruth yielded the podium, Thaddeus surprised the room by inviting his wife forward. He introduced her not as Professor Vale or Mrs. Gravewood but as the archivist whose integrity preserved our future laboratories, then ceded the floor entirely. Lucasta breathed through her diaphragm the way lectures had trained her and proposed an alternative strategy. Rather than protract Knox's public dismemberment, they could redirect any awarded damages into a non-profit research trust managed by the same agricultural college that had verified the farm's purity. Funded soil science, she argued, would starve future smear campaigns by increasing transparent knowledge for every grower, even competing cane fields. Initial resistance, why feed the enemy's region, dissolved as she wove a historical analogy to the medieval truce of God, explaining how sworn pauses in conflict often birthed legal frameworks stronger than swords. By the time she concluded, the sentiment wall glowed optimistic teal, the board voted 10-1 in favor, with Ruth abstaining only to preserve her reputation as eternal skeptic. That evening Lucasta found the vault corridor outside crystal compass transformed. Where gouges from thermite charges had scarred stainless steel, crews had installed a narrow display niche lit by fiber-optic candlelight. Inside sat the damaged leather glove torn from Bourbon Hour's leader, its missing fingertips blackened where frostbite and liquid nitrogen had met. Beside it, on a linen card, was an inscription in Thaddeus's precise hand: "Fortresses erode, archives endure." She realized the display was neither trophy nor threat but a mnemonic, an artifact reminding every passerby that the lab's integrity had been tested by flesh and fire and stood. She traced the glass with 2 fingers, then stepped into the lab where the lattices hovered like domesticated auroras. In the glow she removed the velvet pouch from her pocket, slid the tuning key into its slot, and watched as the core sphere shimmered a pink-gold gradient she had not seen before. Halcyon's neutral voice echoed overhead, new emotional register detected, synchronous resilience. She laughed, soft but genuine, and wondered whether a machine could coin poetry by accident. Close to midnight Thaddeus joined her, sleeves rolled, tie abandoned, as if entering a sanctuary that required shedding ceremonial armor. They moved among the plinths, testing no words this time, letting footfalls and breathing activate subtle flickers in the crystals. At the central globe she turned, placed her palms flat against his chest, and felt the metronome of his heart, slower now, though still edged with static from the day's board warfare. She asked, in low tones, how many years he had carried the title, Cursed Groom, and whether he was ready to retire it. He answered not in syllables but by sliding both hands to the zipper of her field jacket, easing it down with deliberation that felt as much ritual as desire. The quartz above brightened into spiraling tones, neither turquoise nor violet, but a braided spectrum that reminded her of sunlit oil on river water, chaotic yet unified. She realized suddenly that the spheres were no longer analyzing them, the display monitors were off. He had disabled measurement to leave this moment unquantified. Later they stood against the mezzanine railing watching maintenance drones recalibrate laser alignment. Thaddeus retrieved the obsidian wafer from her pocket, held it between thumb and forefinger, then set it on the rail's edge and snapped it in 2. Data would still be in secure servers, admissible in court, but this shard, their shard, would exist only now as powdered silica drifting onto the lab floor. Lucasta felt no loss, only lightness, as though some carbon weight in her lungs had converted to oxygen. He said, almost shyly, that dissolving records could be dangerous for a man whose enemies multiplied like spores. She replied that archives, properly kept, knew when to delete duplicates. The following dawn, before either had slept, they drafted a joint press statement announcing the Maple Soil Integrity Trust. Every phrase fused his fluency in engineering risk with her cadence of historical precedent. He insisted her byline appear first, she insisted on a final sentence in his voice, a public avowal that contracts, when redeemed by compassion, became engines of innovation. They sealed the document and scheduled it for global release at noon. Only then did they retreat to the penthouse, kicking off shoes by the elevator, moving through rooms still scented with rain and heliotrope. As Lucasta folded herself into fresh sheets, she felt the tower's HVAC sigh like a distant ocean, heard drones polishing scars into smooth steel far below, and understood that fortresses indeed eroded, but sometimes erosion carved windows into walls thick enough for dawn to enter without invitation. A year to the day after the warehouse fire, Vale Maple's rebirth ceremony unfolded on the same hillside where the first trees had been tapped in Lucasta's great-grandfather's era, only now a tinsel pavilion of transparent graphene arced over the grove like a poised dragonfly wing. Thaddeus's engineers had laced the canopy with nano-LEDs that harvested photovoltaic trickles even under overcast skies, and at dusk those diodes came alive in slow pulses of green and violet, replicating the spectral signature of an aurora inside the orchard itself. Journalists jostled among university botanists, federal trade officials, and a surprising number of schoolchildren bussed in from 3 counties. Rowena's idea, because children, she declared, possessed the one demographic immune to smear campaigns. At the pavilion's heart rose a circular dais of reclaimed barnwood where 2 copper evaporators gleamed like twin hearths, one boiled ordinary sap for demonstration, the other simmered batch one of Aurora maple, whose suspended mica sheets refracted the brew into glimmers that slid up the flue like captive constellations. Lucasta arrived not in bridal silk but in work boots and a tailored indigo jacket stitched from salvaged tanker tarpaulin, the practical epilogue to her theoretical prologue. She took the stage carrying her great-grandfather's tally ledger, a relic Knox's mercenaries had never managed to touch, and unfolded it under a conical spotlight that left dust motes orbiting the parchment like minute planets. In a clear, resonant voice she recited 3 entries, the first, noting the farm's founding after the 1918 flu, the second, logging a loan repaid during the Great Depression with barrels of syrup instead of cash, and the third, dated exactly 1 year earlier, simply reading, fire, loss, promise. She closed the ledger and told the crowd that today a 4th line would be inked, one documenting not debt or disaster, but a covenant between archival memory and engineered light. Applause rippled, warm but brief, because everyone sensed that spectacle awaited. Thaddeus joined her on the dais in a charcoal field coat whose interior pockets bulged with emitter nodes. Without fanfare he attached 6 of them to the evaporator's copper rim, each disc no larger than a coin, yet when he tapped an app on his wrist-com the nodes released ultra-short photon bursts tuned to excite the mica particulates. The syrup surface exploded into a living topography of emerald and amethyst curtains, miniature replicas of polar skywaves curling within the pan. Children gasped, a food influencer in the front row forgot to hit record. As the light show stabilized, Thaddeus turned the control comm to Lucasta, and she dipped a wooden tasting ladle, letting a ribbon of the luminous syrup sheet into a glass pitcher. The liquid glowed even off heat, its shimmer attenuated yet unmistakable, as though dawn itself had liquefied. It was Rowena's turn then, she wheeled in a stack of iron griddles sizzling with wheaten pancakes, and the children formed an unruly queue. Each received a single silver dollar cake, a pipette drop of Aurora syrup, and a biodegradable napkin bearing the new seal, a twin triangle crest now overlaid by a maple leaf so that the former symbol of captivity became a sigil of rooted resilience. The first taste set off a chain reaction of awe, laughter, and urgent demands for seconds. Food safety officials sampled next, their stoic notebooks briefly forgotten as tongues registered dark amber depth followed by an electric whisper of wintergreen, an optical illusion turning into gustatory surprise. When cameras turned back to the stage, Lucasta addressed the forward rows of investors who had helped bankroll the Soil Integrity Trust. She explained that 10% of Aurora's profits would route automatically, via smart contract, into open-access soil analytics for any North American sap producer, organic certification optional but transparency mandatory. In a single slide she showed projected yields for research plots already underway, fungi that fixed nitrogen without synthetic fertilizers, biochar mixes that locked carbon even in thawing permafrost, and drone-borne spectrometers, descendants of crystal compass, that could read chlorophyll stress before discoloration showed to the eye. Investors nodded, sensing a virtuous circle that tasted as sweet as the syrup but felt even more lucrative. Thaddeus spoke last, stepping to a podium that rose silently from the floor, for concise paragraphs crafted the night before with Lucasta's editing pencil tucked behind her ear. He acknowledged the term, cursed groom, confessed he once accepted it as immutable code, and said the past year had rewritten that variable in ways no algorithm could precompute. He finished by citing a line from Lucasta's Dartmouth lecture, now etched into the underside of every Aurora bottle cap, truth poured slowly will crystallize into something no flame can burn. As he stepped back, the pavilion lights dimmed per pre-programmed cue, and the graphene canopy above became a giant projection surface. The lattice spheres of crystal compass, linked by secure channel, translated the ambient vocal tapestry, laughter, applause, quiet weeping, into an auroral bloom that unfurled across the roof, a data-driven mural of collective sincerity. For 20 unbroken seconds the night sky and the glass sky mirrored each other with coincident swirls. The real magnetosphere happened to be active, sending faint ribbons over Vermont that matched the engineered ones below, a symmetry so improbable that even Lucasta felt the mythic tug of destiny. The event dissolved into lanternlit wandering among the trees, but Lucasta and Thaddeus lingered at the evaporator long after the last pancake vanished. She ladled a final spoonful, let it cool, and offered it to him directly. He tasted, eyes shuddering, and when they opened she saw neither shields nor algorithms, only gratitude edged with marvel, an expression she realized she had waited a lifetime to witness on anyone's face, let alone his. He returned the spoon, and, breaking every protocol of public composure, kissed her syrup-stained fingertips in plain view of every remaining camera. Flashes erupted, but for once she did not care what story the pixels might spin. Archives, she knew, would hold the deeper narrative, and now their archive was no longer split between his vaults and her ledgers, it had fused into living record flowing amber and green against the star-washed dark. Hours later, after guests departed and maintenance drones folded the pavilion like an origami chrysalis, Lucasta wandered to the edge of the grove where sap buckets chimed under a shifting breeze. Thaddeus joined, sliding an arm around her waist, both of them content to watch northern lights fade into ordinary starlight. He asked, half-whisper, whether she believed the sky had conspired with their spectacle or merely reflected it. She answered that causality was the least interesting form of truth, translation, the way one language of light became another of taste, was what mattered. He laughed low, pulled her closer, and murmured that a year ago he would have demanded the dataset, tonight he was content with metaphor. Somewhere uphill a nocturnal owl cried, a single note sharpened by cold, and for the first time since signing their improbable contract Lucasta felt utterly at home in both silence and sound. The bruise of last winter's fire, the sting of Knox's sabotage, the frozen fear of Bourbon Hour's incursion, all remained archived chapters but no longer dictated thesis. Ahead lay new annotations, unwritten yet already forming, a grammar of mercy, threshold, and dawn, etched not on vellum but in the very sap that would rise tomorrow when the grove awakened, unaware of commerce or courts yet inseparable from the covenant two unlikely archivists had forged beneath its waking boughs.